A couple questions before we start out. How many people here have been programming with a client-side object model as part of their day job for a while? Okay. How many people are just brand new to the client-side object model and are really trying to get their sea legs? Okay, a couple people. And then there's the, are you using SharePoint on premises or SharePoint online? So answer one of three. I'm using SharePoint on premises, I'm using SharePoint online, or I'm using both. How many people are just working with SharePoint on premises? Okay. And then how many people are just using SharePoint online? Okay. Not that many. How many people want to know both sides? Okay, so it looks like the majority of us, for the last couple years, we were in denial. This Office 365 is just a Microsoft marketing thing, and it seems over the last year, all of a sudden, we see, a lot of activity there, and the fact that, we'll likely, as SharePoint developers, over the next couple of years, the majority of our work, will be inside the cloud as opposed to SharePoint on premises. I'm not going to say that SharePoint on premises is going away anytime soon. Many of us are very dug in, given the SharePoint initiatives and the farm solutions that we have. But certainly Office 365 development, as opposed to SharePoint on premises development, is becoming, more common. Now, who am I? My name is Ted Pattison. I own a company called Critical Path Training. There is an email, ted@tedpattison.net. Also, there's going to be a download. I'm going to show a bunch of sample code and these PowerPoint slides that I'm showing. There's the URL. I will show this URL again at the end of the session. So if you don't have a pen out, this will be available. And then by the time they assemble all the resources for the conference, my slide and code samples will be available, along with everybody else's inside there. So this session download link is really for the people who just need this tonight as they get back and want to start working on things. Okay, so what are we going to cover? We're going to start with just client-side object fundamentals to make sure that we can run before we run faster. We're going to talk about user and app authentication. We're going to talk about optimizing CSOM code. We're going to talk about remote exception handling. We're going to talk about creating content types and site columns and lists, hooking up things like remote event receivers with the client-side object model. And at the very end, we're going to look at two different areas where the client-side object model is the only game in town when you want to do specific types of SharePoint programming from across the network, which is working with taxonomies, managed metadata, and working with the publishing APIs. Okay, now the next thing we should think about is, why should you use the client-side object model? Seems like there's been a lot of excitement about the SharePoint REST API and the fact that if you're using CSOM to some degree, you're hard-coded into using Windows and .NET. If you use the SharePoint REST API, you've decoupled yourself, you're kind of with Microsoft's strategic direction. Yeah. But still, we're going to find that when you compare SharePoint REST API programming to CSOM, CSOM gives you strongly typed programming. And the compiler says, hey, look, buddy, you got this wrong. Where when we're doing REST API calls, you're basically crufting up text and putting it into headers and into request bodies. And if you get something wrong, you're going to basically hopefully find out at runtime during your testing, or your user going to find out. So there's definitely a big productivity advantage to using the client-side object model today. Now, another thing that we'll see is that we have the capability of batch processing. Create list 1, create list 2, create list 3. Now send that all over as a batch. So that's something that really hasn't existed in the SharePoint REST API. I think some people have talked about, Andrew Connell is doing a talk tomorrow where he's going to talk a little bit about batching with REST APIs. And what you're going to see is it's a lot of work. Plus, a batch has to be all gets or all posts. So definitely the fact that CSOM just lets you do batches and hit execute query, and it's just very easy to do, is another big benefit. CSOM also provides some functionality beyond what the SharePoint REST APIs provide today and maybe ever. And taxonomies and working with publishing are the two obvious things that everyone talks about. Now, when it comes to picking the client-side object model versus the SharePoint REST API, I think it really comes down to personal preference or a decision that someone in a team makes, and it's safe to say there is no one right answer. For me personally, I feel that when I'm writing server-side code, whether it's in a SharePoint provider-hosted app or it's in a console application that I basically want to build and then basically deploy up inside of Azure as a web job, that I just get a lot more productivity. And you're going to get a lot faster traction. So one of the examples I'm going to show is creating site columns and content types. So I think everybody is of the opinion that the way that we used to create site columns and content types with XML, maybe it was a bad idea in 2007, but it's a really bad idea these days. So we're trying to find some way to automate the creation of these things. And I could do it with a CSOM, and someone else could be doing it with a SharePoint REST API and trying to figure out. And I have IntelliSense, and I have these things that just make it just much, much faster to get the job done. You'll see some examples of that. But also what I feel is that CSOM is great for server-side code when you're writing C# code or VB.NET code and you're in Visual Studio. While it's possible to use it from over, in JavaScript inside the client, it's a lot less of an elegant fit. You'll see that CSOM gives you collections that are not friendly to so many of the JavaScript libraries that we have out there. So my own personal preference is when I'm writing client-side JavaScript code to prefer the SharePoint REST API. And when I'm writing server-side code or just writing C#.NET code, I prefer the CSOM over the SharePoint REST API. Now, what are the types of things that we can do with a client-side object model? Well, connect to a specific SharePoint site and get properties or set properties for the site or the containing site collection. I can create site columns, content types. I can create lists, document libraries. I can create list items. I can upload documents. We'll see examples of those. Also, registering a remote event receiver. So I'm not going to spend much time talking about the remote event receiver infrastructure of this talk, but I will show you the one thing that Microsoft leaves out, and that's how we have to hook it up in a real-world scenario. And you can't do it with XML unless the target list is inside the app web, which is not very common. We want to create a list in a SharePoint site, which to us is the host web, and the only way to create a list and hook up a remote event receiver is to do it programmatically, and CSOM, to me, provides the best way to do that. Some of the other things that you can do is you can actually create site collections with new advancements that they put into the client-side object model. I'm not going to talk about that in this talk because Vesa has a talk that he's going to give on Wednesday, and he's going to basically go through a lot of the patterns and practices that they've created and show you some really good, insightful information about using the client-side object model to create site collections. He also has a talk tomorrow where he's going to talk about best practices in branding and use the client-side object model to upload branding assets. And basically, the way that he's going to recommend is going to be very different than the way that we've done it with farm solutions in the past. Okay, so given that background, when we had the client-side object model in SharePoint 2010, it really just covered SharePoint Foundation functionality. I could create a list, I could create a document library, a child site, but it didn't extend over to SharePoint Server functionality. I couldn't execute a search. I couldn't create a group in a term set with managed metadata. I couldn't do things in publishing, and we had to fall back on the server-side APIs. Well, as you know, Microsoft gave us this big push saying, stop using farm solutions and writing server-side code, move over to the app model. And when they did that, they had to put their money where their mouth is and really expand the client-side APIs that are available to us. So when you look up here, these are all new client-side object model APIs that became available in SharePoint 2013 that weren't available in SharePoint 2010. Now, when we use the client-side object model, what we're going to see is that there are these two core assemblies that we have to use in all cases. Microsoft.SharePoint.client.dll and Microsoft.SharePoint.client.runtime.dll. I like to think of the top one, SharePoint.client, as the types that we program against, and SharePoint.client.runtime as the plumbing behind the scenes that takes care of actually making the calls across the network. But it turns out that there's quite a few classes in SharePoint.client.runtime that we'll be programming against ourselves. Now, there's also a bunch of CSOM assemblies for SharePoint Server. There's just kind of a list that we have inside there. Recent breaking news is that they have now created a new CSOM package that you can basically discover and install from across the network. Now, also note that when you look at the client-side object model DLLs, they'll have version 15 and version 16. And what you'll hear from Microsoft is version 15 is really intended for SharePoint on-premises, 16 is intended for SharePoint online. I've used version 16 for both, and I haven't run into problems. But I've seen notes from Vesa saying when you use the things like provisioning site collections on-premise, he's basically saying that you should be using the 15, not the 16 versions. But what you'll see is, let's say you create a simple console application, and you have this set of references that come out of the box. So now when you install this NuGet package for the client-side object model for SharePoint Online, what we're going to get is this set of assemblies that are automatically added. Vesa has a blog that was put up earlier this month. If you read through, you'll see that you can get started with development very easily. You can go ahead and add this NuGet package to a SharePoint provider-hosted app to basically upgrade all the DLLs from 15 to 16 inside there. And they're working on creating a redistributable package so that if you have to install a CSOM client, that there's going to be support as opposed to you having to worry about getting the DLLs on that client machine yourself. Okay, now the basic architecture is that we'll write some code that will program against things like site objects and web objects and this thing called the ClientContext. But what's going to happen is we're going to call this method called execute query. And behind the scenes, on our behalf, the runtime is going to create calls that go across the network. Now, we don't have to get involved, so there's a lot of details that I could tell you, but you don't really have to know. There's SOAP calls. The request goes across with XML inside the body, and then they return back as JavaScript object notation. But it's all these proxy objects that are emitting the calls on your behalf, so you, as a developer, never have to get involved with any aspects of Windows Communication Foundation, which is great, because there's just a boatload of details that we have to get on top of if we worried about that. One, to me, negative aspect is that they are SOAP calls, not REST API calls, so they're more expensive. So ultimately, if you were going to, really do, serious benchmarking, you might find that the SOAP-based nature, versus REST-based nature, might have implications on performance. But the idea is you're going to work with these client-side objects. They're going to make calls across the network. There is this entry point, which is client.svc. And when the calls hit that entry point, Microsoft just has code to look at the XML document that has instruction 1 with parameters, instruction 2 with parameters, and basically it executes on the web server just using the server-side object model, and that's how they interact with things like the content database inside there. Now, when we get started, the first thing that we have to do is deal with this thing which is the ClientContext class. So the ClientContext, I like to think of it as my connection to a site and the containing site collection inside there. So whenever we create a ClientContext, we always do it with the URL to a specific site, whether that's a SharePoint on-premises site or whether that's a site up inside of Office 365 and SharePoint Online. Now, if I look at this basic hello world code right there, so lots of you have written this code, but the idea is that we have these different objects. If you're new to CSOM and you've used the server-side object model, you're used to SP site being your site collection. Well, we dropped the SP, so we just have site class, which represents the site collection, and we have web, which represents the site. The ClientContext gives you access to that site collection and site object. But remember that we're creating these client-side proxy objects. So when you create an object, how could there be any meaningful information inside there? So what we have to do is we have to tell the client-side object model, here's instruction 1, go populate the site collection object. Here's instruction 2, go populate that site object. And then execute query is how you tell it, now go ahead and make the call. And generally, you're going to have one or more instructions that it's going to go carry out inside there. Okay, now, if I do a quick demo here. So let's go ahead and if I say, open this, and here's all the code that we're going to show inside here. So if I do something as simple as possible right here. So what I have here is basically just the hello world code. And as I make the call, let me go ahead and open up Fiddler. And you could basically say, CSOM is handling all the interaction with the server, so why bother looking at Fiddler? Well, you can tell a lot when you're trying to optimize your code about what's being moved back and forth inside there. So here is an example where I'm trying to touch something that doesn't have any information because it hasn't been populated yet. So when people start using the client-side object model, there's a lot of mistakes where they try to touch something, which is the client-side proxy object, but they haven't been through the steps of initializing those. Now, if I go and I look back over here, you can see that each time you call execute query, what's going to happen is that it's going to make a call, and the entry point is inside the SharePoint web server, _VTI_bin client process query. And the idea is that if you're using Fiddler, you can come over and you can basically see the outgoing body as XML, and you can see the response as JavaScript object notation. So the one thing that I like to do is really make sure that the things that are moving back and forth are the things that I care about. Now, one other little note here is when you're looking here, you see all these calls to sites.asmx. So there is a need whenever you do updating against SharePoint to acquire this thing which is called the form digest. If you do REST programming by hand, what you're going to find is that you have to get the request digest and pass it back in a special header. So one big benefit of CSOM over the SharePoint REST API is it just handles the form digest management behind the scenes. You don't have to worry about it. But it does make outbound calls right here. If I go back here and take a look at Control-Alt-J, let's go back here to look at the client-side object model down here. If we go back and I come down and say, where is my client context? It's right here. There is a form digest handling enabled. If you're just reading data, you can set that to false, and it doesn't make those queries back to that site.asmx. One other note is if you're doing SharePoint REST API programming, that's the old school way to get the form digest because it's a SOAP call. So now we're supposed to go to _API/context info. But the CSOM still kind of uses the old school model because it was created for SharePoint 2010 and carried over. Okay, now, as we keep going through here, let's talk about user and app authentication. Now, if you look at this code right here, I just have a local farm, and so I'm just basically creating the client context right here, and I'm not really telling it how to authenticate. So the default nature of this is to basically do something that looks like this. There is a credentials object. Remember, it's going to make WCF SOAP-based calls, so it basically has to set up authentication. And so by default, it uses system.net. And there is a credential cache and basically default network credentials. So what happens is if the user is inside the LAN and the user's logged on to his or her desktop with their Active Directory account, it just silently uses that identity. But the problem with this is it works great on demo machines that are all-encompassing. It works great inside of LAN environments, but it's going to break down pretty quickly as your client moves to the other side of the firewall. So what we need is some other techniques. So the first technique is that if you are using on-prem and you're using Active Directory accounts, but you need to reach across the firewall, you want to go to something like basic authentication. So you can create a new network credential object, which is applied by the system.net namespace, just part of the core .NET framework. Once you've set that up, you're going to be able to work with that. Okay, now, let's say that I'm not using SharePoint on premises, I'm using SharePoint online. Now, when the CSOM first came out, it got to be really difficult to basically figure out how to make things work. And before your CSOM code would run, they would basically give you these instructions that were very hard to follow. Basically go to the browser, authenticate, rub your stomach around while tapping your nose, make friends with a militant guy who owns Active Directory. Who wanted to follow those? So a guy named Victor Willen, who's one of the presenters here, wrote some really neat code that basically did all this programmatically. And he was a hero for a couple of years until Microsoft stole his idea and now just made it part of the CSOM. So here is an example of using this new thing, which is the SharePoint Online Credential Object. So if you see Victor, say thank you for the SharePoint Online Credential Object, or at least the initial idea. Now, notice that here we have the username, which is basically your organizational account up in Office 365 and Active Directory. You have your password, but you can't pass the password in a clear text string. So we have to create this special .NET object called a secure string. And then what we typically do is then move through the regular string, take the things inside there, and put them in. OK, that's not my real password. I've never been called Pinky Doo, and I'm not 42 years old, so don't get any ideas. OK, now let's say that we don't want to authenticate as a user. I just showed you code that you can use a CSOM, authenticate as a particular user, and then your code has the identity and the permissions of that current user. Well, when we're creating SharePoint apps, we don't just authenticate as a user. We authenticate as the app. And the app sometimes passes an access token with the user identity, and then you have both app and user identity, and you're constrained both by the user permissions and the app permissions. And then you can also create app-only access tokens and pass those. Now, when Visual Studio 2012 came out, we had the token helper class, but we didn't have the SharePoint context class that's added to your applications. So what we can do is use the token helper class to create an access token that then you could manually attach to a SharePoint REST API call. Or once again, CSOM gives you a nice productivity boost over working with the SharePoint REST API calls when you're using C# or VB on the server by taking care of creating the access token and automatically attaching it to the authorization header for us. And the way that we get that done is by calling token helper dot, and they have two different methods. One for when you're on-prem and you're using an S2S trust, token helper dot get S2S client context with Windows identity. And then also, if you are going and using SharePoint Online, or if you're on premises and you've configured an ACS trust so that you can use OAuth in your SharePoint apps on premises, then we would call get client context with context token. And you kind of see the extra work that you have to do to get things such as the host URL and also the authority that you're calling into. Now, when Visual Studio 2013 came out, the people that created the projects for creating SharePoint apps added this second piece of code, which is SharePoint context. And kind of the short story, like let's say I come back up here and I say, I would like to create a new project. I would like to create a SharePoint app. And this is my provider-hosted app inside here. So let's go through here, and I want to connect to that. I want a provider-hosted app. I want to use MVC. That's all well and fine. This dialog basically says, are you using STS in on-premises? In which case, you're going to add this inside here. The top basically says that I'm using OAuth, and it relies on either you're in SharePoint Online or your on-premises farm has a configured trust so you can use OAuth. But in general, your app needs to communicate with Windows Azure Access Control Services. OK, let's go ahead and choose Finish. So there was this big criticism back in Visual Studio 2012 that I had to hard code my code to either S2S or OAuth. So what they did inside there is that they created this model. And let me go ahead and SharePoint confessions. I know we all have a few. Microsoft com, and what is it? Everybody at the same time, Pinky Do at 42. Okay, so what I want you to see here is they created this model where they have a SharePoint context, which is an abstract class. And then they have two derived classes, basically one for OAuth and one for S2S. And then they have a SharePoint context provider. And so the idea here is that you write your code one way for the majority of scenarios. Once again, if I come down here and take a look at SharePoint context right here, let me go ahead and collapse the outlining right here. What we can see here is that we have SharePoint context, which is abstract, and then down below we have basically one for ACS and one for S2S. And when we say SharePoint context provider.current, it creates one or the other. And what it does is it simply looks to see if there's an incoming context token. If there's an incoming context token, we know it's OAuth, not S2S, because S2S doesn't have a context token. And it creates one of the base classes and gives you that as the SharePoint context. But then what we're able to do is write simple code that looks like this, that now we can basically use the same code, whether we're using S2S or OAuth inside there. So back here on the slides, note that the SharePoint context that you'll get has 4 different methods for creating a client context object. One to give you the app plus user identity to the host web, and one to give you the app only identity to the host web. And then if you're programming against the app web, there's 2 methods to get either the app plus user or app only tokens inside there. Okay, remember with app only calls that they drop the identity of the user, which gives you the ability to elevate your permissions above the current user. If you're not using app only calls, the app has to be given permissions to create a list inside the host web, and the user also requires the permissions. It's not one or the other, it's both parties need that permission or your call will fail. So the idea of app-only calls is that your app has been given permissions to do something, but you're afraid the current user might not. You want to drop the user identity so you can call in and succeed at something that the current user doesn't have the ability to do. The other big use of app-only calls is if you have a provider-hosted app that kicks off batch processing at midnight and there's no current user around, the app can just call into SharePoint as long as it has the current permissions to do something inside there. Now, the general usage is that the client context is a disposable object. So generally, we have a using statement as opposed to calling dispose on it, and we do our work inside of the using statement, and as it drops out of that block of the using statement, there's a transparent call to dispose that's automatically added by the compiler. Okay, now let's talk about code optimization. Take a look at this code. If you've been programming with CSOM, we should see instantly that there's some issues with this code. So one of the problems is that I'm just saying load the site, but I haven't told it what specifically to load as far as the properties in the site that I care about. Also, I basically say, give me all the lists, and then when I get all the lists back, it contains all these hidden lists and hidden lists that are document libraries like the master page gallery. So the idea of querying, getting a whole bunch of stuff, and then filtering on the client side makes no sense. You want to make sure that if you have a where clause, that your where clause is propagated with your CSOM call to the back end, so you're only moving across the network the things that we need to. Okay, so once again, if I call ClientContext.load site, that basically says load whatever you feel like loading, and the default nature is to load what we call these scalar properties, which is everything with a single value, whether it's an integer or a string or a GUID. It doesn't load collections, but we're still moving a lot more across the network. So when we want to optimize our code, first thing is we have to use Lambda expressions. Okay, how much should I go into here? How many people are comfortable with Lambda expressions? Okay, seems like a little over half of us. Lambda expressions were something that was added to the .NET framework with LINQ, Language Integrated Query, backed by Anders Heidelberg back with .NET 3.5 and C# 3.0. So CSOM was created later. And so what the CSOM team saw is that the LINQ team created this syntax where you can write some code in C# that's strongly typed, that gets checked by the compiler, And they can look at that and translate it to things like SQL statements behind the scenes. So the people that created the client-side object model kind of had 2 years of looking at that saying, hey, we want to use the same idea. So the idea is that we can write Lambda expressions as a second parameter value inside there. Once again, let's go back here. Let me go back to that first example that I have right here. And here, when I want to optimize things, well, there's my Lambda expression. So the first thing that we're creating is a parameter. And you can use any name that you want except the obvious one, which is the thing over to the left, site. You can't use that, but I can say S. There is the Lambda operator, and then if I say something like site.title, now I basically just asked for the site. And once again, the CSOM runtime is taking that Lambda expression and just basically translating that into the XML that gets sent across the network saying, don't load everything, just basically get this one property and bring it back. Now, this is not a joke. I had one class where I had a student that was so shy, and finally, after 45 minutes of looking, he said, where's the Lambda key on the keyboard? And I told him it was 2 keystrokes. Okay, so what we'd like to do is basically optimize things as they're sent across the network. If I want more, I can say site, comma, s lambda s.title, comma, s lambda site.url. So you can include multiple things inside there. Now, the next thing we want to do is get the where clause across the network. So when we get back all the lists, I don't want the lists that are hidden. So link has an extension method, which is the where extension method. And so here, when I say site.lists inside here, now we say lists and list.where. So basically, this is just the familiar link extension method. And so I have this collection of lists. And so then when we get to specify, and for each one of those lists, let's go ahead and specify the criteria that we don't want that list to be hidden. OK. Now, if you just go that far, you basically said, don't give me lists that I don't want, but then it's going to load the scalar properties for each one of those lists, when all I might want is the title. So the next thing that we can do is use the include. Now, you'll see that include is not part of link. As the CSOM team within the SharePoint team created this, they realized that they needed their own special method to get this kind of behavior inside there. So include is an extension method that's added by Microsoft.SharePoint.client.runtime.dll. And so what this allows us to do is basically say, when you bring back lists, for each list, just include the title and include the default view URL. So there's one way to optimize, saying don't bring back things I don't need. But also, if you just loaded the lists, the default view URL would not be added inside there because it's not a scalar property. So here I'm actually getting things that wouldn't come back naturally. And so then what we can do is do these two in a single statement that we have down there. A little bit unwieldy the first time you start using it. But what we want to do is be looking over at Fiddler and making sure that the things we're bringing across the network, are as small as possible. Now, a couple other things. Let's say you want to check whether a list exists. There is a grand tradition in SharePoint of not giving us a simple method to do this, so why not go ahead and compare that onto CSOM? So if I want to check whether a list exists or not, I could basically say, bring back the list, and just give me the title where the list title equals such and such. We do an execute query. We take a round trip across the network. And then we can simply look at the collection count. And if it's basically 1, the list is there. If it's 0, it's not there. And then if the list is not there, I can go ahead and create it in a second request over to the server. Now, another thing that we can do is use the ClientContext load query. So here's another way to basically say, give me all the lists that are not hidden. So what's nice about this right here is that it allows me to write link query expressions, which might just feel a little bit more intuitive than using .where and .include. So if I say from list in lists where, and if I say list.hidden equals false, that's kind of obvious. Don't give me things that SharePoint has deemed as hidden. And also, maybe I don't want the document libraries. Remember, document libraries are inside the list collection. So if I say list.baseType equals 0, it says give me the standard lists, but don't include the document libraries. If I say list.basetype equals 1, it will give me the document libraries, but leave the lists behind inside there. But the idea is you create a link statement, and this one is going to be an iQueryable, which returns type list, and then you're able to call ClientContext.loadQuery. Note that loadQuery returns back to you an object, and that object is for eachable. And the idea is once you call execute query, it translates that link query statement into XML. It gives you back a collection, and then you can enumerate through those. OK, now, I like these link statements, but you can't use them with list items, because unfortunately, list items have different makeups as far as what columns they have. So when you use items, you basically just have an indexer which is not strongly typed. So when we want to go off to a large list and get back a subset, we're basically down to working with our old friend Camel. Okay, many of us have used that for over a decade, but still a best practice at certain points with a client-side object model. So there I'm creating a new Camel query. I'm using XML syntax that only the mother of Camel could love. Begins with field ref, name, first name, value type text equals B. And so basically that's why I would get back everything in a list whose first name started with the letter B inside there. Now, once you have a Camel query, down at the bottom there you kind of see I'm calling list.getItems. And now we'll go ahead and just load in that list item collection, and it basically runs your query, gives you things back, and once again, it's for eachable for you to go back and discover what came back inside there. Okay, now the last thing that I want to show here is this ability to batch commands. Now, let's say that I go back here and I have another simple example right here, which is the customer generator. If only it was this easy in business. And so what I have here is something that I created just to create sample data. I think I must have been up late one night in a hotel room, probably on crystal meth, and decided to write a piece of code where I put the 1,000 most popular girl names, boy names. There's a whole bunch of companies inside here, but there's just a random generator saying, give me another customer that has first name, last name, company, work phone, home phone, email. And then I extended it for BI work, so it actually has US area codes that relate to the city, so you can do things like see distributions inside there. Okay, that has nothing to do with this demo, but now, let's go here, and I'm going to go ahead and run this right here. So what I want you to see is that when it comes time to do a bunch of things at a single time, whether it's create 10 lists or whether it's basically add 1,000 items to a particular list, do you want to do it in one round trip to the server? Do you want to do it in one round trip per item? Or do you want to batch something together? So with this right here, note that if we look at this site over here, we have a certain number of customers inside there. So if I come back over here and we run this right here, once again, let me get back to this right here. Here, we're going to basically say the batch size is 1, so do 250 round trips inside there. And so, what you'll find is that you wish the CSOM was a lot faster. That will be your first reaction inside there. But also, instead of running 250 round trips, let's run batches of 50, and let's do 5 round trips. And so you're going to find that depending on the power of the servers, the network connection between your code and the server, things are going to vary. And you'll always find that batching things together is going to be faster. But batches can get to a certain size where SharePoint just rejects it because it's too big. But what you can generally do is kind of find some type of middle ground inside here. And different suggestions are get outside of the Visual Basic debugger. Go into the actual environment with a live released code as you do your benchmarking inside. Now, as far as this type of code right here, here's an example where I'm going to create a certain number of customers. So there's the customer factory.getCustomerList. That's the code that just generates whether you want 10 or 1,000 or 100,000 customers, it will create those for you. But now we basically have a batch count. And so a little bit low tech, but we just say batch count equals 0, batch count plus 1. And when we hit the batch size, go ahead and call execute query. And on the way out, if we've done more inserts and we haven't committed them, do something on the way out. Okay, so once again, batching can optimize your performance, but yet I'll weigh your expectations by telling you that everyone who thought they were going to get great results, the results are okay, but they're not going to be life and death. You're not going to get down to 1/100th the performance by doing one round trip instead of one. Okay, next thing we want to look at is remote exception handling, another very important aspect of this. So look at this code right here. You have your client context, and let's say we want to delete some lists. We don't know if list 1 or list 2 exists, but let's go ahead and delete list 1, delete list 2, and then call execute query. Now, the first thing to realize is that those first 2 lines are never going to fail. So there you are writing some instructions for your child. You're saying you got to go to the store. So here's instruction 1, cross the crowded freeway. 2, swim across the lake of crocodiles. 3, get to the store. It's never going to fail you while you're writing the note, but when you hand the note to your child and call execute query, that's when it's going to fail. So the idea is when you're batching things together and you're doing more than one thing at once, if you don't do any remote exception handling, the first time there's a problem, it basically just errors out, returns back to you. You have no idea about what succeeded or what failed. So what we have inside of the CSOM is an infrastructure for creating contingency plans when things go wrong over on the server. So what we have is this exception handling scope. And the idea is that we can do a start try, and then a start catch and a start finally. When they created this, they wanted to make it feel as close to C# and VB try catch blocks as possible. But that's a language feature, and this is an API. So if you have a try block without a catch block, C# compiler says, can't do that, that's a problem. If you have a start try that doesn't have a start catch or start finally, compiler doesn't care. But once you submit the batch, SharePoint will care. SharePoint will fail if it sees that you have a start scope with a start try that doesn't have at least a start catch or a start finally. Okay, now, unfortunately, there is a beauty mark. What is a beauty mark? Think of Marilyn Monroe, the American icon of beauty, most beautiful girl in the world back in the 50s, but yet she had this mole on her face. And the idea was it made her approachable, it made her personable. Okay, so what is the beauty mark of the client-side object model? You have a server error code that's OWASP -1. So you can't ever really figure out what happened. So that is an unfortunate detail. So all the error handling that we're going to do basically says, go ahead and delete the list. If the list doesn't exist, go ahead and move on, and then create the list. But if the error is that your code doesn't have enough permissions, you're basically still going to get an error inside there. So once again, what's unfortunate about the CSOM is I can't, over on the server side while my code's running, saying if error 1, do that, if error 2, do something else. So unfortunately, I have to run these batches just assuming that any type of error is something that you're expecting. So the way that we're going to write our code is going to look like this. We're going to have an exception handling scope. Scope 1, scope 2. Let's go ahead and try to delete list 1. If list 1 is not there and there's an exception, it basically sweeps it under the rug and goes and tries to do the second thing inside there. You could have exception handling scopes inside of exception handling scopes. Inside of that start try, I can put another scope inside there. Always remember that you can never have ClientContext execute query inside of a scope. Because the whole idea is when you call execute query, scopes have to be executed as a whole unit inside there. Okay. So what we find ourselves doing is wanting to optimize by basically doing more things at once within a batch. And the more things you do at once in a batch, the more you have to write remote exception handling. But the more you write remote exception handling, the more complicated and the harder to maintain your code is. So I think that's a balance that you have to work with. And if performance is not an issue, I've seen plenty of people just say remote exception handling, I'll use it at times, but I don't rely on it. I just do round trip, see if the list exists. If the list doesn't exist, I'll do another round trip to create it. But that's a trade-off that we have to make when using the client-side object model. Okay, next thing we're going to look at is provisioning things. Site columns, content types, lists. So let's start with the basic creation of a list. So when we're using the client-side object model, we have a set of classes that all end with information. Web creation information, list creation information, list item creation information. So the idea is we create one of these initial configuration objects. So there I create the list creation information, I set the title, the URL, put on the quick launch. List information.template type is the integer of the SharePoint list type ID. So if you're a geek, 101 is document library, 104 is announcements, 105 is contacts. If you're not a geek or you want to make your code more readable, you can use the list template type dot announcements, contacts, documents, but then you have to cast that to an int to assign it back to the template type inside there. Now, there are certain things on the list creation information that we can't get to that we want to get to. So the other common aspect of this pattern is once we call site.list.add and we give it the list creation information object, we then capture the return value, which is of type list. Then I can say list.onQuickLaunch, enable attachments, and then we call update. And notice that I've done all that without making a round trip to the server. And then we call ClientContext.execute query inside there. Okay, now let's say I want to check whether a list exists or not. So lots of people like to write this kind of code. We have an exception handling scope before I try to create a list, see if a list of the same title. You should really be checking to make sure there's not a list of the same URL already exist. And if they do exist, go ahead and delete them, and then go ahead and create the list inside there. Now, let's say I want to create list items inside here. Well, it's not strongly typed. We create a list item creation information object, and in many cases, you create this object and you don't do anything with it, but you still have to create it. When you ask, why the heck do I have to create it? It happens when you're creating things like folders. You can set the type of item to be a document, item, or folder inside. But when we're just creating items, we create a new one of these list item creation information objects. We have a particular list, list.addItem, and then once you get the item back, then you use the index or syntax to basically assign values to site columns inside there, and you call update inside. Okay, let me go ahead and switch over to another demo. So this next demo has some of the code that we have seen inside here, but there's one other piece of code that I want to show live. So this one is called Serverside CSOM, and the big thing I want to show here is how to create a list and then to register a remote event handler. And it's kind of sad when you look up at MSDN, all they show you how to do is do it the XML way. And the only way that you can register an event handler with XML is if the thing that you want to attach to is inside the app web. Well, the thing I want to attach to is the list that I just created inside of the host web, which basically says then you have to figure out how to do this programmatically. So let me go ahead and run this piece of code right here. And as I run this piece of code, I'm going to go back over here. We have this announcements list. And so what I'm going to do is, what I should have done before you all started watching me, is delete the announcements list inside there. OK, now I'll go back over here to this right here. So what we'd like to do is we would like to create a new list. So we just show the code to create a new list and add some items inside here. But now that we have created this announcements list inside, what we'd like to do is put some behavior behind it, maybe validation behavior. And the idea is remote event receivers require that we use a provider-hosted app, not a SharePoint-hosted app, because you need an entry point somewhere on the local network or internet for the SharePoint host to call into. Now let's say I do something like I love Apple. I'll pretend to be Andrew Connell bragging about his iPhone inside here. We'll go ahead, we'll try to save this. Title cannot contain inflammatory terms such as Google, Apple, or Netscape. Okay, so what we have inside of this solution right here is, first of all, I've added this remote event receiver. And so with the remote event receiver inside, I have something that we handle process event. So this is the function that SharePoint reaches across the network and calls into. So this is just my response code. And in this case right here, I'm going to do things such as look at the title, and if the title contains something, then I use this result and return it back to SharePoint with that particular error message right there. But now we come over here and we say something like, I love SharePoint. I also wanted to kind of show how we can do something with the actual text the user put in, like bounce it to uppercase in this case right here. And so here is an example where you can't do this in server-side events. Server-side events, you have to use the after event to get the same effect. So with remote events, what you're able to do is look at something like the title. If the title is not already in uppercase, I can take this result object that I'm pushing back. I can say result, changed item properties. And so here, SharePoint calls into me saying, do you have anything to declare? Any validation? Or do you want to change anything the user's done? And so if I look at the title and want to bounce it to uppercase, I can basically bounce it to uppercase, add it to the changed item properties, and return that back to SharePoint to get this effect inside here. Okay, and then the last piece, probably the important piece here, is how do you actually hook this up? So here is an example where, look at the name of this class, Event Receiver Definition Creation Information Object. So when I create that right there, I give it a receiver name that just has to be a unique string, the receiver type, so what type of event do I want to handle? I have to give it the URL so SharePoint knows where to call into the entry point of my SVC file. And then I basically add it to the receivers collection of the particular list that I'm doing inside there. Okay, so once again, these things are easy to do if you know how to write the code to do it. One other little tidbit I want to give you is that debugging works great when you have a local SharePoint farm, such as the case when you're doing on-prem work. But in our case right here, the remote web is at a local host address. What if you try to debug this in Office 365? The SharePoint servers don't figure out that local host means your machine. So it is possible to debug those, but the approach you're going to have to use is to go to Windows Azure and create an event hub. And the idea is that an event hub has a known endpoint that you can give to SharePoint. SharePoint can call inside there, and then you can register basically a call to your debugger. So you can get debugging working inside. You just have to work with Azure. And a guy on the SharePoint Visual Studio team named Shax did some really neat things in the later version of the Visual Studio tools just to make that lots easier, where now you're basically creating the event hub, getting the URL, pasting it into a window inside of your project properties, and they do all that work behind the scenes to hook things up. Okay, next thing we want to do is I got this requirement to create a bunch of lists, and I don't want to just create lists with one-off columns. I want to do the whole 9 yards, or the whole 9 meters. I'm not sure if they have that expression over here. But I want to create site columns, I want to create a content type, and create a list based on that. So let me go over here and bring up a piece of code. And what I wanted to do is kind of keep this code in a simple form so you can digest it. So I basically just have it in a console application. And before I run this code, let's go ahead and go here. I'll go ahead, I'll run this code right here. It's going to create a term set. I'll talk about that later, but it also is going to create a document library, a picture library, upload a bunch of images. It's then going to create a bunch of site columns inside there. It's then going to create a content type based on those site columns. Then it's going to create a list and configure the list to use that particular site column inside. And so the net effect of the code we're about to look at is, there is my image library. So I created that, uploaded everything I want with CSOM. I also created the products list inside here. If I go back to site settings and we look at the site columns inside, once again, my CSOM code just created those guys right there. If I look at content types, once again, my CSOM code just created this right here. So once again, this is work that so many of us have done over the years with features in XML. And Microsoft is screaming at us saying, don't use that technique anymore because it's very brittle and it makes it impossible to move your code around unless you have the exact same farm solution and you install it everywhere. And updating gets to be really messy. So the idea is it's much better if you just do things manually because you're using SharePoint out of the box. Or if you do something that has the same net effect of doing it manually, which is basically writing CSOM code to do this type of work. So this is what Microsoft is now recommending if we want to do things like create site columns and content types. So here's a piece of code, just a little utility function for creating a site column. And note that when we use the client-side object model, what we have is we have this idea of a fields collection. The fields collection is based on, sorry, hope I'm not making you seasick here. A site has a fields collection, which is basically the site column gallery. And you can say add field as XML, but you have to create XML fragments. But what I did here is I created this little utility, and now I can use that by saying create site column, product code is the internal name, product space code is the display name users are going to see, and then text is going to be the underlying field type that has to be supported by SharePoint. Okay, can you create custom field types? Absolutely. Should you do it? No way. Just use what's out of the box. So we're basically going to use the built-in type inside there. Okay, now I want to create a content type. So here's an example of creating a content type through the CSOM by saying content type, creation information, and then when you create it, you're going to pass the content type base type ID. So when I want to do this, now I can basically call my little utility function saying create the product content type, pass in the content type ID for item. So now I've created it based on item. And then the tricky part is basically adding the site columns as field link references. Once I'm all done, execute query, and I've just created my content type inside there. And then finally, when it comes time to create that particular list, I create the list, and the tough part right here is figuring out how to get rid of the built-in content type. So I'm creating a list based on the generic or custom list type. So it has the item content type behind it, and it has one site column, which is title. And so here, we basically say content type's enabled. We add our content type to it, and then we find the content type that was there, content type 0, and we remove that. And then also, I want to make sure that I add the site columns to the default view of the list. And after my code runs, now someone can come up here, and basically that's the view that they're given inside. So I think you'll be pretty happy with creating content inside of lists using this particular approach. Okay, now I want to create a document library. One thing I want to point out is that when you create a list, you should put the root at list/list1. However, when you create document libraries, you do not want to put them at the root. I'm sorry, you don't want to put them in the list folder. You want to put them at the root of the site. So you create a URL that's not list/product images, but something like product images. Let's say I want to upload things with a client-side object model. There's a file creation information object. So if you look at this demo, another neat thing that you might decide to do if you have standard documents or images is that I have a set of images that I've added inside this, and then I have added them inside as resources, which basically mean they get embedded into your DLL, and it's very easy for your code to pull those things out. So if you look at this code right here, it's basically just reaching into resources and pulling out the byte stream for image 1, image 2, and then that's the name that we're going to name those things inside there. So once again, I think you'll find that uploading documents to document libraries or anywhere inside of a site, even if it's not a document library, is pretty straightforward with a client-side object model. Okay, now we're into the home stretch. And what I want to talk about, I got just a couple minutes left, is working with taxonomy. So there is a SharePoint.client.taxonomy. Here's some code that kind of shows you how you could basically get at the taxonomy session. And then one real big thing that changed from SharePoint 2010 to 2013. In 2010, you had these taxonomy groups that were always at the farm level, always at central admin. So if your code had site collection permissions but no farm level permissions, you really couldn't do anything. So for various reasons, Microsoft added the idea of a private group. So a site collection can have a private group, and if your code has permissions at the site collection level, you don't need farm permissions to be able to create and work with these. So once you get to the term store, if I say get site collection group, notice that that last value is true. What this says is if the site collection does not have a private group, just create it on the fly and hand me something back. So also, if you're creating an app, and this works equally well in SharePoint Online as it does in SharePoint On-Prem, I want to go ahead and get a hold of the private group and create term sets and create terms inside there. You do need an app permission, which is the taxonomy permission. But then what we're able to do is simply create term sets inside here. And there's an example of a term set. If we look at the code that I just ran for you, not only did this create site columns, it also created a term set on the fly. So if I go back here and I take a look at term store management inside here, you'll see that my CSOM code was able to get a hold of this private group for the site collection, creating it if required, then creating a term set inside there, and basically adding some kind of taxonomy, and then also taking the steps to create a site column based on that term set, such that when people are working with new or existing items, I have total control over basically creating the managed metadata behind there, using the managed metadata service. Okay, last thing that I want to show, keep saying last thing, is I'm not going to have time to go into it, but I just kind of want to explain what this does. I have some code here that is going to add some publishing site content. So when I work with SharePoint.client.publishing, that takes me beyond just the SharePoint foundation, get a hold of the site, get a hold of the site collection, but now I can work in things like the managed navigation. I can work in terms of publishing sites and creating things inside. So here is a raw, out-of-the-box publishing site. Nothing up my sleeve other than this little piece of code that I wrote inside here. So as this thing runs right here, I can configure navigation, which includes basically creating any type of navigation scheme for that publishing site that I want. If you look at the code, it also sets up page layouts, and then it's able to add publishing pages based on those page layouts inside here. And then after everything is said and done, let's go ahead and wait for this thing to finish up inside there. Let's go back and refresh this inside here. What you'll see is I've created child sites. I've basically added friendly URLs inside there. So once again, a great way to automate adding content in your site, in your publishing sites, and getting away from the XML-based definitions that we've been using in the past that Microsoft really wants us to move away from. Okay, so now that we've been through all that, there's the session download. I'm going to leave that up there for 1 second. Some shameless promotion here. My company, Critical Path Training, is now working with Combined Knowledge. So we're going to have a 5-day training class here in July 6th through 10th here in London. We had a SharePoint on-premises course called The Great SharePoint Adventure. And so then me, the marketing genius, came up with the one for apps, which is The Great SharePoint App Venture. You're not the only one who doesn't get it. But anyway, more information at our website, or if you're comfortable working with the Combined Knowledge folks, they can register you for the class as well, because we're doing it as a joint venture. Other than that, thank you very much for attending. Sorry I spoke so fast, but I didn't speak as fast as Todd did. Thanks very much.